On August 9, 1965, the leader of Singapore, Kuan Yew, broke down in tears on national television. He wasn't crying tears of joy. Singapore had just become an independent nation, but not by choice. It had been expelled from the Federation of Malaysia. At the time, the idea of an independent Singapore was seen as a political, economic, and geographical absurdity. The country was an island of just over 730 square kilometers, with no natural resources, no hinterland, and absolutely no industry. It relied on the outside world for food, energy, and even its drinking water. Unemployment was high, and a third of its people squatted in slums on the city fringes. Its GDP per capita was roughly $500, placing it on par with countries like Mexico and South Africa at the time. Yet today, Singapore is a futuristic metropolis of 6 million people. Its GDP per capita is approaching $90,000 nominally, and over $160,000 when adjusted for purchasing power. It boasts one of the highest standards of living on the planet, with almost zero debt, massive foreign reserves, and world-class infrastructure. So, how did a swampy, resourceless island that was kicked out of its own country engineer the greatest economic miracle of the 20th century? The story begins with a brutal realization. If you have zero natural resources, your only resource is your people. From day one, Kuan Yew and his cabinet operated with a philosophy of extreme pragmatism. They didn't care about ideological purity, they only cared about what worked. This meant human capital became the absolute national obsession. To plug into the global economy, English was aggressively promoted as the language of administration, business, and education, acting as a neutral bridge for a multi-ethnic population. The government operated almost like a hyper-efficient corporation. It established a strict system of meritocratic leadership, attracting the brightest talents to public service through highly competitive salaries. They knew that to survive, Singapore couldn't just participate in the global market. It had to outcompete, outwork, and outsmart its larger neighbors. Everything that followed, from housing to finance, stemmed from this single, desperate premise. In the 1960s, the conventional wisdom for newly independent developing nations was import substitution, protecting local industries and treating foreign multinational corporations with intense suspicion. Singapore did the exact opposite. The government realized that waiting for domestic entrepreneurs to build an industrial base would be too slow and uncertain. Instead, they created the Economic Development Board in 1961, effectively turning the country into a giant one-stop shop to court foreign capital. When other post-colonial countries were locking their doors, Singapore threw them wide open. They offered generous tax holidays, built industrial estates from scratch, and implemented strict labor laws to guarantee industrial peace for foreign investors. The strategy worked perfectly. In 1969, Texas Instruments set up a semiconductor plant, triggering a flood of foreign tech investment. Shell and ExxonMobil built massive facilities, turning Singapore into a global petroleum refining hub, despite the country not having a single drop of oil. By the 1980s, Singapore was the world's leading producer of hard disk drives. They didn't just invite the multinationals in, they partnered with them, making Singapore an indispensable node in global supply chains. But economic growth means nothing if your workforce is living in squalor. In 1960, hundreds of thousands of people lived in crowded slums, lacking basic sanitation. To fix this, the government created the Housing and Development Board, or HDB. What the HDB achieved is staggering. The government passed the Land Acquisition Act, allowing the state to acquire private land cheaply for public development. Today, the government owns over 90% of the land in Singapore. Because of this, more than 80% of the resident population lives in high-quality public housing. And this is not social welfare. Around 90% of these residents actually own their flats on 99-year leases. But HDB is also the ultimate tool of social engineering. After experiencing deadly racial riots in the 1960s, the government introduced the Ethnic Integration Policy in 1989. This policy enforces strict ethnic quotas in every single public housing block, mathematically mirroring the national demographics. It legally forces Chinese, Malay, and Indian Singaporeans to live together as neighbors, deliberately preventing the formation of racial enclaves and engineering social harmony from the ground up. You might be wondering, How did Singapore afford to build all this housing and infrastructure without plunging into massive foreign debt? The answer is the Central Provident Fund, or CPF. The CPF is a mandatory savings scheme. Both employees and employers are legally forced to contribute a significant percentage of wages into a personal account. Historically, this combined contribution rate has gone as high as 50% of a worker's salary, though today it hovers around 37%. Unlike Western tax and transfer welfare systems, the CPF is not a pooled risk system where the rich pay for the poor. It is an individual accumulation system. The philosophical difference is total. You are saving for yourself. Crucially, in 1968, the government allowed citizens to use their CPF savings to pay for their HDB public housing. This created a brilliant closed-loop financial engine. The state forces you to save. You use those savings to buy a home built by the state, and the state gets the capital it needs to fund national development. It simultaneously builds infrastructure and turns citizens into asset owners who are deeply invested in the country's stability. This brings us to a unique feature of the Singaporean model, state capitalism. The government doesn't just collect taxes and regulate, it acts as a massive corporate shareholder. To manage the immense wealth generated by the country, the government established two massive sovereign wealth funds. The first is GIC, which manages Singapore's foreign reserves, investing well over $500 billion internationally to protect the nation's purchasing power. The second is Temasek Holdings, formed in 1974 to commercially manage assets previously held by the government. Temasek doesn't act like a traditional government ministry. It operates strictly for profit. It holds majority stakes in the nation's biggest companies, including Singapore Airlines, DBS Bank, and Singtel. It also invests heavily overseas, taking stakes in global giants like Alibaba and BlackRock. Singapore's government doesn't just rely on taxing its citizens, it relies on investment returns. By running the state like a highly profitable investment fund, it keeps corporate and personal tax rates exceptionally low. If you look at Singapore's central bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, or MAS, you'll find another system that exists almost nowhere else in the world. Most central banks, like the US Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, manage their economies by raising or lowering domestic interest rates. Singapore doesn't do this. Since 1981, MAS has entirely given up control over domestic interest rates. Instead, it actively manages the exchange rate of the Singapore dollar. Why? Because Singapore's economy is profoundly open. Trade is over 300% of its GDP. Almost 40 cents out of every dollar spent domestically goes to imports, including raw materials, food, and energy. In this environment, manipulating interest rates would just trigger massive, uncontrollable capital flows. Instead, the MAS guides the currency against an undisclosed basket of currencies of its major trading partners. By allowing the Singapore dollar to steadily appreciate, they act directly to dampen imported inflation. It is a highly specialized monetary tool, perfectly engineered for a small island, completely dependent on the outside world. However, the Singaporean machine is facing intense pressure. First, there is the demographic crisis. The intense, highly competitive culture has contributed to a collapsing birth rate. In 2025, Singapore's total fertility rate plunged to just 0.87, making it one of the lowest on the entire planet. The workforce is shrinking, forcing a heavy reliance on foreign labor, which currently makes up around 25% of the total workforce. Second, the cost of success is staggering. The cost of living and property prices are among the highest globally. To stop the property market from overheating, the government has repeatedly intervened with aggressive cooling measures, including an additional buyer's stamp duty that hits foreigners with a massive 60% tax on property purchases. Finally, there is the political trade-off. Singapore's incredible efficiency is built on strict social control. The People's Action Party has ruled uninterrupted since 1959. Critics point out that this stability comes at the expense of civil liberties. Political opposition, press freedom, and public assembly are tightly restricted. It is a system that prioritizes collective wealth and order over individual political freedom. So, can other developing nations copy the Singapore model? The answer is, partly. The principles are absolutely reproducible: extreme openness to global trade, a relentless investment in human capital, and zero tolerance for corruption. We are seeing this adaptability right now, in 2026, as the government commits billions to new national AI missions, aggressively pushing its manufacturing and finance sectors into the age of artificial intelligence. But much of the model cannot be copy-pasted. You cannot easily replicate Singapore's strategic geography sitting right on the Strait of Malacca, one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. And most importantly, you cannot easily replicate the sheer speed of political execution that comes with a de facto one-party system. Without the gridlock of partisan politics, Singapore can plan 30, 40, or 50 years into the future. Singapore isn't just an economic miracle, it is a highly engineered, perfectly calibrated machine. It was built for a very specific environment, and it runs flawlessly. Whether it can adapt to the global demographic and technological shocks of the next 50 years remains to be seen. But if history is any indicator, Singapore has made a habit of surviving against the odds. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Singapore's incredible rise, please leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our future videos, and let us know in the comments which country's economy we should explore next.